So hello everyone and welcome to the Modern Chinese Foodways Virtual Conference Roundtable, a retrospective panel on 50 years of Chinese food studies. My name is Michelle King and I'll be moderating today's event. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And on behalf of my colleagues, our project director, Wendy Jiaqian Fu at Emory University, and a fellow co-collaborator, Jacob Klein, at the Food Studies Center of SOAS University of London. I'm really excited to welcome you to today's event. Wendy and Jacob, do you want to wave and say hello?
Hello.
Hello.
You will be seeing more of them at various events throughout the rest of the conference. We have attendees from time zones all over the world for this, so I just wanted to give a special welcome to anyone who's staying up very late in their time zone to watch. I also want to alert everyone that this event is being recorded so that others who aren't able to make it today can, in real time, can watch it on our website later. On our conference website, which can be found at modernchinesefoodways.com, it contains a whole wealth of information if you're interested in Chinese food, and I encourage you all to explore it. In addition to the conference schedule and details, we've also devoted an entire section of the website with links to online digital resources for teaching and learning about Chinese food. It has everything from popular YouTube channels to crowdsourced recipe guides. Our website was designed by Xiaowei Wu, and the digital resources were curated by Cynthia Peng, who is also our social media coordinator. I want to thank both of them for maximizing our 21st century digital footprint and making it as beautiful and as useful as possible. We also have our own Modern Chinese Foodways Conference YouTube channel. It has video interviews with all of our conference participants, including with today's roundtable panelists. I encourage you to delve deeper and watch some of those videos if you'd like to learn more about the life work of the scholars featured in today's roundtable. In particular, I'd like to give special thanks to our talented research team, Dr. Mukta Das and Dr. Chenjia Xu, who did such a marvelous job with the video interviews of all of the conference participants. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our conference sponsors. Our conference has been made possible with generous grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Jiang Jingguo Foundation, Emory University's Hightower Fund, the Confucius Institute in Atlanta, and Emory's Department of Russian and East Asian Languages and Cultures. As collaborators, we also want to acknowledge the support of our home institutions, Emory University, the Food Studies Center at SOAS University of London, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Now, finally, we get to turn to our main event. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you the panelists for today's roundtable on 50 years of Chinese food studies. Each of them has had a decades-long career as a pioneer within the field of Chinese food studies, and we are so glad that they're able to join us today to talk about their past experiences as well as their visions for the future. We've called this roundtable 50 years of Chinese food studies because if one were to distinguish a single publication as marking the start of English language Chinese food studies, it would have to be Casey Zhang's 1977 edited volume, Food in Chinese Culture, Anthropological and Historical Perspectives, which remains a landmark in the field even as it was published now 44 years ago. The purpose of this conference is to build upon the foundations of that volume and bring it up to date with a more explicit focus on modern Chinese foodways. We thought that it would be fascinating to frame our conference by asking our distinguished panelists to contextualize the establishment and development of the field of Chinese food studies as a whole. It's my great pleasure and honor now to introduce to you our 5 distinguished panelists. I'm only going to very briefly, highlight their major works in Chinese food studies. If I were to read their entire CVs, we'd be here all day. Of course, all of them have written extensively on other topics as well as Chinese food studies over the course of their long careers. And as I introduce you, if you want to just wave or say hello so people know who you are, that would be great. Jean Anderson is professor of anthropology emeritus at the University of California, Riverside. Professor Anderson was an original contributor to Casey Zhang's Food and Chinese Culture volume. He's the author of The Food of China, and more recently, author of Food and Environment in Early and Medieval China. Francesca Bray is Professor Emerita of Social Anthropology at the University of Edinburgh. Professor Bray authored the volume on agriculture in Joseph Needham's monumental Science and Civilization series. She is also the author of The Rice Economies, Technology and Development in Asian Societies, and recently co-edited Rice, Global Networks, and New Histories. Françoise Sabban is Professor Emerita at l'École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. Professor Sabban has written extensively in French on historical Chinese foodways. Some of her articles in English include Court Cuisine in 14th Century Imperial China, The Problem of Preservation by Fermentation in 6th Century China, Chinese Eating and Cooking in the Oxford Companion to Food, and The History and Culture of Food and Drink in China in the Cambridge World History of Food. James Woody Watson is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at Harvard University, who is, I think, joining us now from his farm in rural Illinois. I think that's correct. Yeah.
Wi-Fi works today.
Okay, great. Professor Watson is editor of Golden Arches East, McDonald's in East Asia, co-editor of The Cultural Politics of Food and Eating, and co-editor of The Handbook of Food and Anthropology. And our final panelist, David Y.H. Wu, is currently Graduate Faculty of Anthropology at the University of Hawaii, Adjunct Senior Fellow at the East-West Center in Honolulu, Adjunct Fellow and Academic Advisor at the Institute of Ethnology of the Academia Sinica in Taipei. Professor Wu is author of Traditional Chinese Concepts of Food and Medicine in Singapore, and he is co-editor of Changing Chinese Foodways in Asia, co-editor of The Globalization of Chinese Food, and editor of Overseas March, How Chinese Cuisine Spread. And one final technical note for our audience, please feel free to ask questions of any of our panelists by typing them into the Q&A box feature in the bottom of your Zoom screen. My colleague Jacob Klein will be amassing all the questions in the Q&A box and sharing them with our panelists later in the hour. We plan to devote about 15 minutes to the roundtable discussion, leaving at least half an hour for audience questions at the end. And so and I also wanted to say my apologies in advance to all of the panelists, as occasionally I may have to jump in to make sure that we keep on time. So without any further ado, I'd like to begin. I'm going to ask a few questions to all of our panelists and give them all a chance to answer. And then we'll see where the time is, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So my first question is, I was able to watch, again, I encourage all of our audience to watch the long video interviews of all of our panelists today. I was struck in the video interviews by how often many of you described a kind of luck or serendipity or unintentionality in the way your careers developed in Chinese food studies. Many of you also encountered derision or at least disbelief from your colleagues who couldn't believe that someone might seriously study Chinese food or eating habits. I wonder if you have a favorite aha moment from the decades of your past career, an episode that confirmed your belief that Chinese foodways were really worth researching. Or alternatively, you can answer, out of all the Chinese food-related research that you yourself have published, what has been your favorite study and why? So who would like to begin? And if it's like a class, I'm just going to call on you. So, Francesca, would you like to begin?
Certainly. Am I muted? No, I'm not muted. Well, I think there were many aha movements, but obviously buying the book 44 years ago was one aha movement, and reading works by Jean and others were aha movements, but I think it really all fell together for me that food was something I should not be interested in simply, but should work with. In 1988, when I went to UCLA, And I was teaching across history and anthropology courses for the Center of Chinese Studies. And I proposed a course on kinship in China, which was a fabulous experience and had wonderful students in it. And my idea was to bring together historical and anthropological perspectives, which was not terribly common in American academia at the time. So on the reading list, I included the path-breaking work that Woody Watson and Evelyn Rorsky had just co-edited, which was called Death Ritual in Late Imperial and Modern China. And I read all the chapters with close attention. When I got to Stuart Thompson's chapter on death, food, and fertility, somehow everything suddenly fell into place for me because I had done my fieldwork in Malaysia, and I suddenly saw how actually being in a field, literally a rice field, connected to food and to death and to fertility and to everything in Chinese society. So instead of just thinking, oh, how interesting, food matters, it all fitted together. It clicked into place for me. And I saw how food served to create and maintain every kind of human relationship in China, whether it be with other living humans, whether it be with gods and dead relations, or with the land that sustained human life and society, or the moral obligations of the family, or the moral obligations of the state. Suddenly, I saw all these coming together, and it gave me completely new light on the lived significance of agriculture, which I'm sure you all realize is conceived in Chinese thinking as the fundamental activity. And it's conceived as feeding families and feeding the state. And I suddenly began to see how all of these fitted together, reading that actually a collection on death ritual. So that's me.
Woody, would you like to, since Francesca has now referenced your editing of that book, would you like to go ahead?
Okay. First of all, I'm really delighted, Francesca, that you brought up my old friend and former student from SOAS days, Stuart Thompson. I mean, I agree with you. That was a wonderful essay that he wrote in that book that Evelyn Rorsky and I produced. As for aha moments myself, almost everything in my work stems from my field research, namely experiences in two villages that I lived in the New Territories that Jean knows very well. Jean studied the boat people just down the shoreline a couple of years before I showed up in my first village of Santine, and I had an aha moment. And that had to do with I think I've written about this and talked about it before, my landlord and friend and patron nearby invited me to come to a banquet. And I thought, oh boy, I get to use my skills that I learned how to eat properly and how to use my chopsticks and how not to embarrass people and all of that and how to sit here and not there. And so I got all excited about it. He showed up and we went to, I think I've talked about this before in my interview. We went to the ancestral hall and we waited at the door until 8 people showed up, all men, of course, at that time. And we all came in and we sat down. There was no place to no table. So we squatted around a big pot of food, and it was called pun choi in those days. Or actually sik pun in Cantonese, which means eating from the big pot. And it was a giant pot of stuff in which we all dug in with our chopsticks and started eating. And on the top were big slabs of fatback pork, big white slabs about, as big as a pencil. And they ceremoniously put one on top of my bowl, and I ate it. And I thought I was going to croak. But that was it. If you've ever eaten fatback pork, big slabs of it, you know what I mean. And later, I have more to say about that fatback and what it meant culturally to old people who had no teeth. That's all they could eat in the munch. I'd basically gum that fat. So I sat there and ate this, and then I began to think about the common pot, the big pot, and what it symbolized in a Cantonese community. And I wrote about it in a couple of 3 or 4 times, and I still go back to it, and I still think about it. And I think that's probably the primary one. The other related episode the aha moment I described in the paper for this conference, when I showed up at this first village, and within about the first week, a lorry showed up with pigs, really enormous pigs, and they proceeded to slaughter them behind the ancestral hall, and they were squealing and reaching, screaming. If you've ever heard a pig scream, you will never forget it.
Oh.
And never. It is something I remembered as a kid growing up in the state of Iowa in the American Midwest. But hearing that in a Cantonese village was ricocheting, the noise, ricocheting off of the buildings was something that was just really riveting into my memory. I can still hear it when I close my eyes. And so that was an experience, and I knew something was going on that I had to keep track of. And I've been working around those issues ever since. And all my other work is derivative of those initial aha moments having to do with life in those villages.
Wow.
Okay, I guess that's it for
Jean,
me.
did you want to go next?
Sorry.
Jean, did you want to?
Thanks. Yeah. First, I want to acknowledge my enormous debt to several people on this panel. I feel like a kid among my teachers, because Françoise and Francesca and Woody and David have been just so incredibly nice and good to me, and as fantastic mentors. It's just been wonderful having you in my life, believe me. So that's part of it.
He's my, don't be courteous. He is my senior by 2 years at Berkeley, so I defer to Jean.
All right, yeah, okay. But anyway, what happened to me was somewhat different. I went to Hong Kong to do general ethnography. As an anthropologist, to do general ethnography, special attention to fisheries development. I found out a lot about fisheries development. I'm a human ecologist, not a China person, I should say. And so I spent the next some years publishing on human ecology and fisheries development with special attention to China. And I did publish one, but the Cantonese I was working with wouldn't talk about anything but food. I mean, you ask them about kinship and you get a sentence about kinship and that's food. You ask them about politics, you get 2 or 3 sentences about politics, but then food. You ask about anything, and pretty soon the conversation turns to food, and you wind up going out to eat. And so I, being an ethnographer of the old school, I tended to record what my subjects talked about. And so I wound up with a lot about fisheries development, politics and stuff, but an enormous amount about food. So I published a little note about food, which Casey Chang found, and bless his heart, he was a wonderful mentor. And my other great mentor in food studies was Ed Schaefer, who I have the deepest debt to. I'm still in touch with his widow. She's such a sweet person. Anyway, so Casey contacted me to write a chapter in that book on food and Chinese culture. And that got me started on thinking that we needed to write, there needed to be a general book on the cultural ecology of food in China, which became, the food of China. And that got me kind of into nutritional anthropology in general. And so I taught a course on nutritional anthropology for many years at UC Riverside, which then became a book, Everyone Eats, with reference to a marvelous poem by the great Japanese poet Ryokan. Everyone eats rice, but no one asks why. Just stop and think about that for a minute, and then you'll have something to really laugh at. I forgot to say, everyone asks rice, no one asks why. I say this to people, they just laugh at me, but stop and think a little, you'll have something to really laugh at. So I figure that's a great subject for a book. So basically, I just kind of go with what people talk about, and Cantonese in Hong Kong in the old days talked about food. Okay.
They still do today too.
I know they do. I've been back.
Yeah, I guess speaking of Casey Zhang, David, would you like to go next? I know you had wanted to share your memories of him.
Yeah, that has to do also with my study of food. Like Casey, we were both born in Beijing, but I'm the 9th generation Taiwanese. And Casey, I don't know, maybe 3rd or 4th. Anyway, we, since childhood, myself, 3 years old, I remember travel around China. Our parents' generation were all educated in Japan, and from Japan go to China. And so my food study, in part, great part, actually relate to my lifelong experience. Well, I'm much older than Woody and Jean, at least more than 10 years, but I consider myself their students. I learn a lot. Later I introduce some more. But Casey and I, we met many times after we went back to Taiwan after Second World War. We went through the same path, National Taiwan University, and then came to the United States to do graduate work. But in my case, I'm more complicated. One thing I should like to say, the aha moment since my childhood, so many ahas, that there's no such thing as one Chinese cuisine, as we all know. And I realized Chinese everywhere are different. They speak hundreds of languages and they eat, thousands of different things. Cantonese are terrible because they can eat all those, now almost distinct animals. That's what we learned in childhood. I experienced that when I was, I started to do field work in China. So I would like to very quick to say, I have been an anthropologist since I was 18. And that was when I was in Taiwan. Long story, you can go through my interview. But whenever I meet other anthropologists, they say, oh, David Wu, are you the David Wu who wrote the McDonald's in Taipei? Or are you the David Wu who wrote the book, The Chinese in Papua New Guinea? I say, well, I'm both. I'm one and the same person. I just heard, like Francesca was doing field work in Malaysia. I am lucky enough to be working at the East-West Center after I got my degree from Australia and spent 4 years in Papua New Guinea and learned to speak all kinds of strange Chinese languages and strange food. In Papua New Guinea, the Chinese told me, hey, have you eaten the human fingers? That's my grandfather told us when we first arrived in Papua New Guinea. So I'll stop here just to say, Chinese food can represent all the Chinese who are all diasporas since 2,000 years ago. And later, if we have time, I'll tell you what Casey told me about his aha discovery of Chinese food. That was in the tomb. He discovered 1,000 years ago. Okay.
Okay, great. Françoise?
So I am the last. Thank you. It's better to be the last because you know what the others have said. So maybe I will be too personal in my testimony, but I understood that you wanted that. So sorry for being too personal, but I must, nevertheless, I must say that I've read all your papers and works on food, of course, and with Jean Anderson, we exchanged. I think we exchanged many letters, and now I can't imagine letters. We were writing letters, asking questions, answering questions. Now it's incredible. And then finally we met once.
Yeah.
And he said me, very nice things. I won't say now, but and we exchange in flesh. You say in flesh in English, en chair et en os. Yes, in flesh.
In flesh and blood, yes.
Eating
In
in the
flesh
plant.
and blood, and it was really good for me. And of course, I was good friend with Francesca, and I work on her book on history of agriculture, which was very important for me. And I read also James Watson's book on McDonald, which was a very important book, I think. So I'm very happy to meet you again for this roundtable, and it was very a good initiative. I was fearing this meeting because of my English and lack of fluent English. I don't know how to say, but in fact, I began to be interested in food habits in China when I went to China in 73, 74. As foreign students, I was belonging to the first group of foreign students going back to China after the Cultural Revolution. In fact, the Cultural Revolution was not finished. We did not know. We have fallen in the Pilin Pikong movement, and well, it was okay. Of course, it was a rich experience in every respect. And as for food experiences, apart from the canteen, I won't speak about the canteen, it was not so bad. We went to dinner a few times in a small popular restaurants near our campus where food was really good. I remember a very good xiangsu tea or xiangsu ya. And but we did not understand a word of the menu. And my friends did not care. They wanted to eat. It was okay. But from that moment, I realized that I could not claim to understand Chinese culture without being able to decipher a menu. So after some years, this conviction gradually led me to take a serious interest in Chinese food culture and about food practices in general. And I did not care if this kind of studies were not trendy at all. It did not affect my conviction that it was important, but as I say in one of the interview, it did not boost my self-confidence, of course, which was not very strong. But I must say that my institution gave me full freedom to work on this subject. That was not at all valued at that time. In that institute, there were very well-known professors like Pierre Bourdieu, Derrida, and so on. So you see that food was not the most important subject of study in my institution.
It was.
Of course, there were some important moments in my long professional activity, but I can say that the first was a research of a few weeks in China at the end of 1980. It was the opportunity to meet some food specialists, Chinese food specialists, and also to sense the enormous changes that would affect this country later. It was very interesting. When I arrived by train, because at that time I traveled by train to go to China. They came to take me by taxi, and I was in the taxi, and the people outside in the streets were still wearing gray clothes. But I thought, but it has changed. They are not moving in the same way. They are moving, they are expressing themselves. There is something, and something is changing. So that was my first important moment. And the second maybe was my stay in Kyoto. 1985-86 at the Research Institute for Humanistic Studies, where I was invited to make a comparative inquiry on Chinese and French food culture. Only Japanese can do this kind of invitation. Thanks to the wonderful library of the Institute, I was able to write an article on the first history of milk in China, based off many recipe books that were not explored, and from the Timi-Yaoshu on until the 19th century. You remember the Timi-Yaoshu, this agricultural treaty Francesca referred to yesterday. This was a virgin topic at that time in the sinological sphere. It's no more, not at all, and either in China or elsewhere. I think that even the few Japanese colleagues who were already working on Chinese food history did not approach it. It was finally published in the Journal of the Institute. This inquiry had fascinated me, and was the start to follow other tracks that led me to the history of sugar in China, and then to other subjects. And the history of sugar too was a subject also quite unexplored at that time. And the history of sugar in China is very interesting because it is the other history of sugar, very different from the Western history of sugar. So maybe I can stop there.
Okay, so thank you so much. This is great to have all this cross-referencing going on right as you speak. The other question actually I have to do has to do with changes in your decades of research on Chinese food studies. Woody and Jean, you started your research in Hong Kong, as you mentioned. David started in Taiwan, and Francesca and Françoise entered the field mostly through their study of ancient texts, first and foremost, before you had a chance to go and experience things in the field. Nowadays, researchers like my colleagues Jacob and Wendy are able to spend months or even years in the PRC itself, and they can pose a lot of different kinds of research questions. Also, different kinds of archival resources have become available. Digitized sources, text searches, the internet, it's all dramatically changed the kind of research, both historical and anthropological, that one can do. So I'm wondering, are there research questions or interests that intrigue you now that you wish you'd been able to study back then, but you didn't have the means or the opportunity to do so? Or just more generally, how do you think your methods of research have changed over the time that you have been in this field? Whoever would like to begin. Okay, David, go ahead.
Okay, I have prepared some photo slides. So maybe Michelle, you can show it. That would help. You see, I'm sure you'll understand my teachers. Since the 1960s, I came to the United States to do research. Graduate work. My teachers, I'm sure you all know, include Levi Strauss, Marvin Harris, Sidney Means, who wrote great book about the sugar, how it come around the world. Pierre Bourdain told us that, you eat because you want to be different from others, raise your status. Arjun Appadurai, Arthur Berger, Symbolism and Food, and my teacher, Woody Watson, who and I, have been in the past few years, 20 years ago, do a lot of work. I became his student. And with all teachers, I must brag that did any of you like me spend the whole week with Levi-Strauss, the 20th century most important thinker, anthropologist. Any of you, if not, I have to brag. When he was invited in the late 1970s to Korea to spend a week and give lecture, I was one of the 5 American anthropologists invited, because the organizer was our good friend, to be with Levi-Strauss since morning and night, not only join the 2-day seminar, but to eat breakfast, lunch, dinner together. We went to the Korean equivalent of geisha house, all that together. But later on, of course, I changed my research since arriving in Hong Kong to teach, and that was 30 years ago. Woody had a lot to do, to persuade me to go to Hong Kong. May I ask Michelle to show one photo of Levi-Strauss, his wife, and I. Here, I'm so proud. Can you think of with his Parkinson's disease for life? When we were living together and going around Korea, he Levi-Strauss insisted handle all the plates and the eating utensils himself rather than anybody to help him. Anyway, the great teacher told us one important thing started after his fieldwork in Brazil and writing all these great books. Important one with food, of course, raw and cooked. Like Chinese, they eat everything cooked, so Chinese are civilized, right? And all the Haolis, that's Hawaiian word, the white people, they are all savages because they eat things raw, like a salad. And I never ate any salad in Taiwan or elsewhere until I came to the United States. Well, I'll stop here, and later you have other questions, I'll talk again. Thank you.
Okay, Francesca, you had your hand raised as well.
Oh, I can't remember quite why now. I think I was going to say that because I had very little to say, I would go first and let the others expatiate. You were asking about what we might have wanted to do differently and suggestions for the future. And I have to confess that actually my research methods really haven't changed all that much. Obviously, it's easier to do things now through the internet, and I do miss libraries, but these days, we're not supposed to spend that time. But I'm longing to get back to one. But I think, if I was advising people on methodological training, I'm sure each of you will have very useful things to say. But as well as the longue durée approach that David was just mentioning, I think obviously not just learning how to eat, but learning how to cook is really important. This is something which Françoise has been mistress of. Fuchsia Dunlop gave me a whole new enthusiasm for thinking about the food of China. I read first a piece by hers in the New Yorker magazine, and I rushed out and bought her book about going to cookery school in China. Absolute pioneer. And the way in which she described how you actually turn, raw materials into dishes, into items on dishes, was applied chemistry and physics, bringing in disciplines which I hadn't really thought of into food before. And it was so illuminating. So I would advise everybody who's seriously interested in food in China or anywhere to learn how to cook it. That said, I live in Scotland and I am hesitating to learn how to even cook, let alone make haggis. It's the equivalent of the pig moment. Okay, that's me.
Who would like to speak on that next? Yeah, Françoise?
I am on the same line of Francesca, I think. And what I will say is very obvious is that the great change brought by the new technologies today concerns, of course, an easier access to a great amount of sources. And when I remember that when I worked on my doctoral thesis, my concern, apart from the building of my corpus, was to gather as much as possible an exhaustive bibliography on my subject. I was obsessed by exhaustivity in bibliographical matter. At that time, in fact, we made do with what we had. And finally, the most important was to be able to build a solid and interesting argumentation. Today, we are in the opposite situation. But in fact, it is just as difficult to select the useful sources without falling into a bottomless pit. But still, the argumentation is the most important, I think. And I have not changed my way of research so much. I am like Francesca, mainly working on books, on texts. So my methods are still very simple. What matters most to me is to start from a question, a kind of curiosity, and try to deepen it, to refine it, and to look for the ins and the outs of it in order to understand its implications. It generally results in a complete transformation of the initial question and to a progression, step by step, until I get an unfolding of constructed investigation, sometimes without even a conclusion. But I try to give a conclusion nevertheless, but sometimes I reach the end of my investigation and thinking, but is there a conclusion? I don't know, but I try to make a conclusion. So of course, the big amount of possible sources and bibliographical references worries me because I always have the feeling or the fear to miss something important. But maybe without knowing it, am I already outdated? And I'm delighted to surf on the net and to discover by chance so many interesting facts and stories like you all. And that at the end of the day, I'm far from my starting point, and I end up saying to myself, no, this is too much. You can't include that. It would be too long a digression. And when I was younger, I used to copy by hand a lot of Chinese texts, and I like that to write Chinese characters. Now I have completely forgotten and lost this habit. And as everybody, as you all, I spent all my time reading on a screen.
Yeah.
Woody, did you want to add?
I wonder if this is the right time to quickly show some books that I suggest.
I think we're going to give Woody and Jean a chance to answer first, and
Okay.
then get back to that. Yeah. Woody, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I want to see David's books later soon. So a couple of things. Listening to both Francois and Francesca talk about cooking, and Jean was also mentioning cooking, actually David as well. how critical it is to understand the internal dynamic, what used to be called the EMIC system of cooking. My wife Ruby and I ended up learning about Chinese food by actually being around it and watching people cook, living in a village where we had no access to anything but the local market. And so my wife Ruby became a really serious cook of local fish. And I still regret and look back with great nostalgia about the meals that Ruby managed to cook from the local fish that then her village friends would come and coach her, tell her how to do it, teach her how to do it. So she really, her Cantonese cooking is, I must say, really, really, really good and very, very down local in the dirt kind of cooking. As for other topics that emerge, there are a couple of things that emerged in my field research experience around local people that relate to cooking and eating that I wasn't able to pursue, partly because I did too many other things. One of which I regret deeply not investigating was the role of teeth, actual teeth. Look inside. I've noticed all of you have teeth. David, let's see. Yeah, David's got a full set. Gene, all of you guys have a full set. I have about half of my teeth are artificial because of the pebbles in the rice that I ate out in villages. You're chomping away and all of a sudden you hear a crack.
Oh dear.
Like a rifle shot, and it's your teeth. And so I have almost half of my molars are replaced. But of course I could come back to Cambridge or London and have them redone. But my village friends couldn't do that. They lost their teeth. By the time most men and especially women, for some reason, were in their early 50s, almost all their teeth were gone except for a few in the front. And they could hardly eat, and many of them were rail thin. I noticed this because I went back to one of our villages in 2009 or 10, and went to a local ritual where all the elders, all the men, actually they were my age or even younger, and they were elders, and that really put me in my place. And I noticed the line of about 50 of these men, and they were all smiling. You know, they were all showing off their teeth, and they were dressed up in fancy, nice new outfits, and they were grinning and they were smiling and they were displaying their smiles. And then I went back later. It struck me something weird is going on here. And I went back to my old photographs from the village in the 60s and early 70s and looked at the elders. None of them had teeth. They all had their mouth clamped shut and with hollow cheeks in lines of a ritual because they couldn't eat. And here was the question then of the fat that I mentioned earlier. It's about all they could consume. And I think that certainly, I think historians and anthropologists have missed something really important about the role of artificial teeth and the role of health, public health, personal health. Men my age still surviving and eating and enjoying a full life and going out to restaurants. That was not true until quite recently. That's one topic that I missed. The other is refrigeration. And I regret that I wasn't able to track the role of preservation of food because refrigerators started appearing in these villages. And I was dumbstruck when I first saw one. Yeah. First of all, for the first decade, nothing but soda pop and beer and a little, maybe some fruit was kept in the refrigerator and cold water because they didn't put actual food in there. They thought it would spoil it. Later, over the decades, each decade I went back, more and more kinds of foods were in the refrigerators. And then freezers suddenly appeared all of a sudden in the late 80s and 90s and then going up. So that the idea then that villagers themselves would go shopping maybe once a week, maybe even once a month because they were busy. And they would buy meat and things and put it in the freezers. And the impact of that on social organization and women's lives in particular had to have been completely profound. But I couldn't do it. Ruby and I weren't there enough. We had too many other things going on, and so it's missed. And I hope somebody will look into the social history of refrigeration. A number of really interesting books have been written about the refrigerator. So I hope that will be looked into. But I have other topics too that I missed. I missed so many things I'm too embarrassed to mention the dozens of things that I missed. I feel so bad about it. Okay.
It's counterbalanced by all the dozens of things that you did write about. So,
Well,
sorry, go ahead, Gene.
okay, thanks. First, from my food scholar friends in Taiwan and Singapore, and other places, I know that we have not even scratched the surface in terms of documenting local foodways in China and in overseas Chinese communities. We really have an incredible amount of straight ethnography to do, and I think that would be the most valuable thing of all. As for me, I have not really done field work in China since 1975. I got all kinds of things happened. So I've been, insofar as I've been working on China, I've been working with historians, mostly with my lifelong coworker, Paul Buell. He handles the languages, he can do translation. I can't handle classical Chinese, but I handle the biology and nutrition and food science and that stuff, and I do the kitchen testing of the recipes. We translated the Yuan Dynasty Court Nutrition Manual, which is an amazing piece of work. And it includes all these cool Central Asian recipes. So I kitchen tested those, except for the recipes for lungs. I couldn't get any lungs. So I'm with you, Francesca. I'm going to do haggis or the Tongoat equivalent of it. But anyway, I've worked with historians to translate various medieval Chinese food texts. I think there's a great deal of that still to do. I just, in terms of preservation, I did do a lot looking at preservation, so I know that end of it. I just, my friend Sean Chun has just translated Madame Wu's cookbook from the Sung Dynasty. And it's not so much a cookbook as a preservation cookbook. It's like all kinds of ways you can preserve everything back in the days before there were refrigerators.
Yeah.
And in a hot, wet climate.
Good point. Yeah.
Boy, do I know a lot about that from, Cantonese and, other modern usages. But, you look at these medieval books, it's true of Madame Wu, it's true of, to some extent, the Yinchan Zhengyao, but not so much. Certainly true of Mizan's cookbook. Certainly true of the Qiming Yashu, which has tons of this stuff. These guys were really concerned with preserving stuff. And of course they were. They didn't have refrigerators, is what he says. So, there's lots of work with the text still to do.
So right now, since we're getting on close to 3 o'clock, I want to make sure that we have enough time for audience questions, as we have almost 100 people who have gathered to watch this roundtable. So I'm going to encourage those of you who are in the audience to put your questions into the Q&A, and my colleague Jacob Klein will sort of read them out to our panelists and share them with everyone. And we can kind of go back and forth if, anyway, you can go, take it away, Jacob.
Great. So we have a three-part question here from Madeline Shi. And I don't know if you want to answer all three of them, or maybe some of you want to answer one part of the question, others want to answer other parts of the question. But Madeline says, of course, that this is a wonderful chance to hear from pioneering scholars in Chinese food studies. And she wants to know, how has the field changed with the possibility of conducting research in China rather than focusing on Hong Kong and Taiwan? Furthermore, how are the stakes of Chinese food studies different from that of European or North American cuisines and foodways? And are there fruitful areas for comparison and or intersection between these areas?
Can I say something here?
Francesca, would you like to start?
Well, no, I didn't actually. I wanted to reinforce that, because as I was listening to everybody speaking, I was thinking it's wonderful to have Françoise here, because she represents an intersection sorry, Françoise, you represent an intersection, but between two cultures and histories that really take food seriously. And I think it shows in your scholarship and the kinds of questions you ask that, you know, coming from the French background gives you a different set of questions to ask. And it strikes me that Chinese food studies at the moment is not entirely, but very largely a North American business. And I would love to hear what other people think about that. And, you know, what the possibilities would be if it was Brazilian or German or Japanese or Australian instead.
Yeah, sorry, David first and then Françoise.
Okay. Oh, yes. I think there's one aspect that in addition to the recipe book and how to cook, you know, I watched television in the United States since the 1960s. You know, Julia Child, her TV show was so popular, and now it's back on television as kind of comedian, you know, comedy show. In any way, what I'm trying to say is, where do you do your study is important, but you can do it and anywhere, everywhere, because Chinese food are everywhere. So if I may ask to show some of the books that my other colleagues outside of this panel published the past couple of years, I think, you know, the Woody's McDonald's in the center, the Golden Arches East, that's the Chinese version. I read all the Chinese, Japanese, and English. I'm one of the authors. But in addition to how to cook or what are Chinese food, we must study the background of ethnic conflict, ethnic discrimination, and how Chinese restaurant people have suffered for the past 100 years in the United States or elsewhere. And so books I recommend young researcher to start to read are, for example, the chop suey, the yellow. The next slide, please. On the right, this book was published in England by English author, I forgot, maybe 20 years ago. You know, how the Western people found the Chinese food disgusting, uneatable. But now everybody's eating Chinese food in Chinatown. And on the left, a new book just came out last year, edited by Jeannie Ban. Actually, you know what is Ban? She's a Hakka. UC Fresno professor, anthropologist, also Vietnam refugee, came to United States as a young kid, and her family opened a restaurant in order to survive. So the American Chinese restaurant is a new one. I have a chapter talking about how Northern Chinese food, Shanghai restaurant and Beijing restaurant, whatnot, like Joyce Chen's restaurant, started just outside of MIT in Massachusetts. All my story should be interested to know how all the Chinese came to invent so-called high-class, authentic Chinese restaurant food. And the next one, please.
Well,
Next
David,
one.
when was this last one published?
Oh, you mean the published?
That last slide there, the first one, the one called American Chinese Restaurants. Yeah, this one here. Over here.
Last year.
No, I forgot. Maybe 20 years ago.
No,
I-
Chinese restaurant is quite new. Jenny Bond was a student of mine, so I had a lot to do with that book.
When was it published, Gene?
It was published, I think, last year.
Oh, okay.
Last year or the year before.
Yes, Jane. Yes, she said she's your student. But we're talking about the right one by English author Roberts, China to Chinatown.
Yeah, that's older. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Anyway, there's one more, also published last year in Japan. Has one of my chapter. This one is edited by a professor at Yale University. Fantastic. All the Japanese historians, literature people who study Chinese food wrote a great historical paper on the history of how the Japanese learned cooking and then opened Chinese restaurants. And I have my chapter on the Northern Chinese food, how it started in the United States, here in Japanese. So the author, editor is Professor Iwama, an all sold out book, but they have a new edition coming out this year. 中国料理跟现代日本, you can read Chinese. Okay, I think we can stop here. And one more point, maybe later we have to have my advice to the young researchers.
Yeah, if we have a chance, we'll get there. But I do want to turn to some of the other questions from our audience. Jacob, did you want to pull out one of the many questions we've gotten?
Gladly. So we have a question here from Lisa Kindler, who thanks everyone for this great discussion. She says that she's a graduate student at NYU working on a research paper on Western influence on Chinese food culture, specifically in Hong Kong. I've been reading a lot about Ta Canping as a great example to see these influences, but do you have recommendations of other areas of cultural overlap melding, or any recommended sources to learn more about this type of discussion?
If I may quickly say, we're waiting for the young researchers to go to Hong Kong to study. What do you say? You know, if they're, I'm sorry, maybe you're only graduate student, but you can, well, get some money from somewhere to go to Hong Kong, start your research. I would say one of my aha moment is when I arrived in Hong Kong to start to teach, you know, other than Ta Canping, I have been dining around Hong Kong. The best French, Italian, Indian, what not, the restaurant, but I haven't seen anyone do any research or write a serious academic paper or book, myself included, because I was busy eating.
Yeah, and me too, yeah.
Woody, did you want to have any insights into that you might want to add?
Well, David's right. I mean, when you're in Hong Kong, you eat. That's I think one of the things that we missed, and I hope somebody younger will look into this in the history, is the Russian bakeries in Hong Kong, because they came down from Shanghai after the revolution. Basically, David and Jean and all of us will remember the wonderful Russian bakeries. And they had restaurants above. There was a little, if you go into the bakery, and then there would be a little staircase and you could go up, and they would have basically Russian dinners and food. And it was marvelous. And the other thing that I remember distinctly, two other kinds of cuisines besides Russian, Indonesian, that's where I learned all about Indonesian cuisine. We used to eat in a lot of restaurants. And then of all surprising thing were French restaurants. There were 2 or 3 wonderful and not very expensive French restaurants that Ruby and I used to look forward to. We would come back from our village and go eat in a French restaurant. And that's the first time we'd ever had French food. We'd never been to Europe, of course. That only came later when we couldn't afford to do that until we were beginning to our teaching careers. So I think those kind of European cuisines in a place like Hong Kong and then also Taiwan, don't get David and me started about Taiwanese local versions of European food and Mongolian hot pots. And oh my God, here I am in the middle of the American prairie.
I remember those Western.
I could tell you about food, but I won't. Okay.
I remember well those restaurants in Hong Kong. The Istimewa, the original Indonesian restaurant there, was still going strong when I was last in Hong Kong a couple of years ago.
Oh, good, good.
And I remember the Russian places, of course, were started by white Russians, but then Cantonese learned to cook the food, and they went right on. And by 1975, when I was last doing research there, I think they were all Cantonese run. There is actually a study now of the Russian restaurants in Hong Kong. I forget who did it.
Oh, really? Oh, okay, good. Well,
I've gotten onto that.
Track it down.
Yeah.
Sorry, Francesca, go ahead.
I was just thinking that one interesting way into that might actually be through techniques and technology, because a lot of fusion cuisine or influences come through being able to get different ingredients, being able to use different cooking techniques, refrigerators, microwaves, Japanese, all those Japanese gadgets, whatever they might be, obviously have an influence on how people prepare, what people think they can prepare and what people are prepared to eat or to consume, as purchasing things in shops. So that could be one interesting angle to look for. That would come in addition to going to a restaurant and saying, well, are these dishes authentically Chinese or are they authentically French? It could give you a rather more specific, concrete handle on some of these issues.
Oh, Jean, go ahead.
I was kind of struck yesterday when I was talking. God only knows why it had never hit me before, but it just hit me yesterday when I was giving my little presentation, that all the Western foods that caught on in China as major agricultural products are all Native American. None of them are Western. Maize, sweet potatoes, peanuts, tobacco, cotton, American cotton, guavas, you name it. This really, pineapples, kind of incredible. Very, very little picking up since the Middle Ages of Western, really Western foods. I think there's a book there for somebody. Chili peppers, for instance, there's another one.
Yeah.
Someone has written a book on that just recently. I know Brian Dutt has a recent book on the.
Yeah, that's right.
Wonderful.
Chili peppers,
Chilies, yeah.
It's a good book. Yeah, good one.
Yeah.
David, did you want to add something?
Yes. May I have the first slide you showed before? I would like to make suggestions.
If we could just get, okay.
Oh, no, the first one with the outlines. Yes, the lower part, my suggestion for future research. Yes, we can go everywhere to study French restaurant, Italian restaurant, whatnot. I think a topic we should pay attention wherever you are doing research is globalization of diaspora food cultures, whether it's Chinese or otherwise, other ones. The ethnic symbols and the national identities at your local restaurant. And in that way, I would suggest you do a long-term intimate ethnography and history of concentrating one restaurant, whether Hong Kong French or Japanese in New York, and see how a foreign cuisine being imagined, improvised, invented, and spread, You don't have to go to Timbuktu to do field research. And one more thing adding to this, whether historians and anthropologists must study how people teach cooking on the television. It's been for a long time. If you read my papers on Saturday, I mentioned this, great celebrity chef go on television teaching you how to cook terrible Chinese food, for example. And they say that's very good. Or French, the same thing. The paper mentioned Joyce Chen, among others. Now Ming Tsai and Yan Can Cook in American television. So that will be another way to understand. Very quickly, last point. I have a great paper that I have prepared with my wife, Mr. Hino, for the past about 5 years or 10 years. And it was presented in a conference entitled Chanson, French Food and French admiration of French music and food in Japan. You can do the same thing in China and elsewhere. So I have to get back to work on this paper. It already took me maybe 10 years field work in Japan. And so I had my suggestions and hope people will understand. I spent 50 years studying 2 restaurants, one in Honolulu, one in New Orleans, already open and closed, change owners, so many years. And I only wrote part of it, the story in my paper, just in the 2 published books. But I hope someone will continue to work on the great Chinese restaurant or terrible Chinese restaurant. Because the cooking is so problematic, it's invented, and it can be argued. Okay, I think I should stop. Thank you.
Okay, Jacob, do you want to choose another question from our audience?
We have a really interesting question here, I think, from Chenjia Xu, who asks, she says, food waste issues are becoming more visible and prominent in China as in many other countries these days. I wonder if food waste ever came up in your research experiences, either in the fieldwork or in historical resources. Thank you.
Well, in fieldwork in a village in the late 1970s, nothing was wasted.
Yeah.
And that has been the big change, I think.
Yeah.
Because there was always the tension between rituals and hospitalities where you have to be profligate and everyday life where you can't afford to waste anything. So I think the big difference in China now would be that actually the waste from profligacy goes into the bin rather than feeding humans or feeding pigs after the event. I'll let my colleagues speak on that.
All right, go ahead, Françoise.
But yes, it's true that in the country, but everywhere in the ancient, in non-industrialized time, also in Europe and so on, there was no waste of food. It's true. It was everywhere like that in agricultural societies. Every food was exploited and nothing was wasted. But in the high cuisine tradition, even in China, in the high cuisine tradition, you have to take the best part of every product. and in taking, for example, the best part of the baitai or the little yotsai, you throw away the external leaves and preserve only the little heart of the plant, of the vegetable, because it's another way of preparing food, because it has to be excellent, and so you are constrained to throw away food. And it is exactly the same in the French high cuisine. I remember in Monaco at the Café de Paris, where we were invited by a very famous chef. I saw how they treated the asparagus. They had a decimeter, I don't know,
A ruler.
To measure.
A ruler.
A ruler, you say, to measure the asparagus, and not to, because they had to be in a measured, I can't express that, I'm sorry, but it's, so they throw away the rest of the asparagus, and only, not the tip, but very precise measure, non pas measure, very precise, sorry.
Measurements.
Measurement of the asparagus. And for every kind of vegetables, it was like that. You had to take the smallest one, and in order to make a very aesthetic dish. So in a way, there are wastes. In another way, there are non-waste. But of course, in China, these last years, we when we went to restaurant, there were some how to say that, some specific little things saying that you must not waste cereals. But everybody has seen that. I'm not very specific, I'm sorry.
Would you like to add to that?
Just talk about waste.
Mm-hmm.
In my initial earlier field studies of villages, nothing whatsoever was waste. Partly any kind of food, partly because there were half-wild watchdogs that would fight each other for even the most miserable of scraps of leftover food. So nothing whatsoever was wasted. But in recent decades, and going back to the same communities after banquets, Ruby and I were shocked by how much wasted food, including meat, cooked meat, was just left. And furthermore, the watchdogs weren't interested because they were overfed. People were actually feeding dogs from so-called dog food that they'd go to the market and purchase, can you believe it, and buy dog food and there were no watchdogs. You could actually walk through a village without a cane to clobber the dogs because they were not interested. And that was a dramatic change that happened in a period of just from about 1980s until into the 1990s, just almost overnight with affluence. So the study of waste is indeed, I think, an excellent idea. If you look at American food and how much is wasted, even during the pandemic, it's shocking. But that's a great topic for anyone.
It is.
Okay, I am going to ask another question that I had wanted to ask all of you, because I always think it's very revealing when people are asked about advice that they would give to their younger selves, things you wish you had known. So if you did have some advice to your younger self, starting out in your research career, what is it that you would want to tell yourself that you know now that you didn't know when you started, where you were starting out? Or alternatively, if you don't want to talk to your own younger self, what advice would you give to current younger researchers who are interested in starting out in food studies or hope to someday join the field? Words of wisdom is what we're looking for.
Oh, be more energetic and don't compartmentalize.
Do you want to elaborate on that at all?
Yes, I went to the field in Malaysia and I was there to study rice farming and how people were adapting to new green revolutionary technologies. And so I studied rice farming and how people were adapting to new green revolutionary technologies. And I was having too much fun, extracurricular fun after hours, you know, just hanging out with people and so on, to study all the other things in the village I should have been studying at the same time. And I always regretted it afterwards. But, you know, then I always tell my students, you go out there, you keep your field notes, you notice everything, you go back at night, you write it all up, you come back exhausted. I had fun.
Yeah, David?
Very good point. Same here. Because when, you know, many years ago, when you started to do field work, you have a theory, whether you forget about theory or not, you started to write about the correct things, whether it's food or the community or kinship. And there are a lot of anecdotes that can tell you great things about the people, the culture that we never publish. So I agree, you know, you perhaps think twice now, keep all the stories you didn't write up, didn't give it to your write in your thesis, but that can help us to learn a lot about the community, the identity, and ethnic relations, and the national, international politics. You know, a lot of things we can learn. If I may, at this point, at one point, in a comment or question or comment, what KC, there's something about KC Zhang Guangzhi. I wonder if any of you know. He wrote an autobiography in Chinese. The title is 番薯人. Have any of you read it? Okay, Jacob nodded. 番薯人 means sweet potato man, which symbolizes he is Taiwanese, not mainland Chinese, not white Chinese. And it's important in the book. Well, anyway, he told about his early archaeological work in Taiwan when returning from Beijing to China. That was, I think we all came back from Beijing in right after war, the war, 民国39年 or 40年, what year is that? And anyway, you know, Zhang Guangzhi was arrested and put in jail for almost 1 year as a senior in the National Taiwan University because he joined the wrong book club, studied the wrong thoughts in Taiwan, just like my father was put in jail in Luidao, the island of Inferno, later becoming Green Island for 10 years. That's why I had to come out to work at the age of 17 to support my family. So that's an interesting book, the food symbol. And one more thing, Zhang Guangzhi, we talked and met in many places. Once he told me his aha. He said, 哎，你知不知道饺子不是咱们中国人发明 ？Do you know 饺子？in 北京话水饺 or Japanese. Now it's becoming Japanese food, gyoza. It's not invented by Chinese, just from ancient home. That I have found out our favorite food when you and I were kids in Beijing, the shuijiao. They're invented by Western people, came through the Silk Road, and we thought, that's one of our Chinese inventions. So a lot of this globalization, who invented what, how it become Chinese food and now becoming Japanese food around the world. The gyoza or 那个叫什么豆腐，那个不是日本人天天要吃的麻婆豆腐。You know who cooked the best mapo tofu? The Japanese. They can cook at home because they have all packaged the ingredient, sauce. And Japanese can cook the best 什么炒肉丝, 青椒炒肉丝 and all that. So study those aspects, whether it's Japanese, French, or Chinese. So all the Chinese best secret of cooking have been learned by non-Chinese and going around the world, becoming the best Japanese food. One newspaper I read one day, that was 10 years ago, is in Moscow, they imported the original authentic gyoza, 饺子 from Japan. So you see the mix of globalization. How do the Chinese still maintain so-called Chinese cuisine, whether it's a Sichuan or Beijing or whatnot? The day by day, when they change, we have to find some interesting restaurant to do a long-term study and to tell people what happened to people, the background, the ethnic, the culture, and identity.
Okay. Who else would like to add your pearls of wisdom to a new generation of research?
Just some. Yes, it's always difficult to give advice, but I would like to encourage students to cultivate themselves, because I mean that they need to be curious of all kinds of food facts and activities. And because the study of food is at a crossroad of several fields, and sometimes one must try to go on unknown fields to better understand a specific point on the very subject you are working on, even if it seems difficult or too technical. It is and in fact, it is a way to find collaboration. You must collaborate with technicians, or I don't know, geographers or economists, and it's very fruitful. And as a global advice, I would say I would advise students to start with specific observations and empirical work, and then eventually, if possible, reach more broader theoretical generalizations, if possible. But it's not always necessary. Sometimes a good monography is very, very useful. It is why I am an advocate of inductive reasoning, not deductive ones. And sometimes students, they feel obliged to begin their work with a big theory and saying, so we have to prove that. No, I think it's better to begin with empirical work and to see and to, as you all have said, to ask to people how they think, and to be very modest at the beginning, I would say.
Woody or Jean?
I was just writing. I think that what I wish I'd done is work 200 times harder on learning the language. But aside from that, I mean, everybody knows the language better than I do. But what I would tell the young, what I have always told younger researchers is first the method of multiple working hypotheses. This was a famous paper by T.C. Chamberlain in like 1895, where he says you should go into anything you do with knowing all the hypotheses that have been generated to explain whatever you're looking at, and be able to work with all of them and test all of them and see which ones work. And similarly, look at everything. Have sharp eyes and pick up on every little detail, because a little detail that other people wouldn't notice may be the great key to all kinds of stuff. And and that implies being pretty interdisciplinary. You don't want to get stuck in a discipline silo.
Yeah, Woody, your last thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree with Jean on this, and David. One of the things that I think it implied in the questions that we heard from Jacob is from people talking about, what kinds of things would we have done? And it occurs to me that I would, if I were doing some new studies, I would, and if I could go back, of course I can't. None of us can do that, alas. I would be working, I'd look at breakfast and pay attention to breakfast, which I didn't really bother with much, because when I was in the village studies period, people ate what was left over from the previous night, and they were lucky to have something, if anything. There wasn't an idea that breakfast was a separate meal. And when in Cantonese, village Cantonese, when you greet somebody, your first question is "Sik Jo Fan Mei Ya?" Have you had your breakfast yet? Sik Jo Fan, meaning the rice or what you've had from the previous night, and you say, "Oh yeah, Sik Jo Goi Sai." You then go through the courtesy of saying, "Yes, I've eaten." But I begin to notice that over the decades of doing this work among the same people and their kids, and then their grandkids, and good Lord, can you imagine I'm now working with great grandchildren and that sort of thing from people I knew originally. Yeah. So to them, breakfast is something very separate. And here's where the emergence, at least in South China and probably in many urban areas, of bread, what we call wheat-based bread, or various kinds of bread. In North China, it was other kinds of bread. In South China, and especially in the Hong Kong region and Taiwan and elsewhere, it was actual bread began to emerge. So there's a lot that could be done with the transformation of breakfast. And as a comparison, I encourage people, if they're interested in these topics, to look at American history and the development of American breakfast, which was equally confused and combobulated earlier until the beginning of about the early 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century, with the invention of so-called breakfast cereals, cornflakes, Cheerios, all the kinds of things that we take for granted. As you and I found now everywhere in the world, you can find it. So there's a lot to be done. And one further pitch for research, as David was saying, I recommend to all young scholars that they begin by reading books like this that I did as a graduate student. This was published in 1957, and it's Lawrence Wiley, and it's The Village on the Vaucluse, and it's all, and in there you find enormously interesting materials on food. And I remember reading it. Of course, it's about a French village. Naturally, there's a lot about food and the organization. There are dozens of books like this, as David has illustrated, that in his case, he was talking about China, East Asia based. And in my case, Jean and I, when we were graduate students, we had to read this stuff, and we had to discuss it. We had to know it, and it was wonderful. And I think that we should all go back and look at these kinds of studies. Okay, that's my 2 bits on that topic.
Well, I just want to thank all of you so much for taking the time to share your experiences and your knowledge and your wisdom. And I am so grateful that you were able to join us today. So please, everyone, join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists. virtual applause, even if you can't. So it's been really wonderful to have this time with all of you today. So thank you so much to our audience.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for organizing this.
Yes, yes.
It's not been easy. We all know it. So thank you.
Forward to seeing all of you at our various other events. Please go to modernchinesefoodways.com to look at the schedule, and if you're interested, to register for some of the additional panels that will be remaining. Thank you so much to all of you.
Okay.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Jacob.
Bye.
Bye-bye.